Hello, good morning, good evening, good lunchtime, whatever it is, wherever you are. Welcome to sunny Edinburgh and to our first episode of the ITSM Explorers, where we are going to be talking about maturity assessments. And this is a stream, guys, so it's not just a presentation straight at you. It's not just a webinar or a Zoom call. It is a stream. We've got a little space down the bottom here, and that's where I can drop in any interactive questions and comments that you may have. So get on there, use the comments area in LinkedIn to drop any questions or comments that you may have about this, and it will drive the agenda to some degree. So we have got a sort of set order in place for the run of show, but it's not fixed. You can actually divert the stream, so to speak, and we will go with the flow. I think that's enough puns about flows and streams and things like that. So we do want you to interact, and you can hit some emojis and things like that if you really would like to as well. The buttons are all there for you, so do go for it. We would love to hear who's calling, watching, and where you are, and we'll be asking you a few questions about maturity assessments and your opinions of them as we go through the show. But without further ado, hello, Steve Morgan. How are you today?
Hello, Martin. Yeah, I am good. How are you?
Yeah, we're doing great. So I guess for those who don't know us, we ought to do a little bit of an introduction, because between us, we've probably got 60 years worth of ITSM experience. Maths don't really work, being as we're both, heading towards 40. We must have started work at 10 or something like that. Something like that anyway. So I kicked off my career as a service desk advisor, and it was totally accidental, just ended up doing that. But I kind of went on to, in fact, write an early ticket management system in DB4, if anybody remembers that. And then I went on to implement service desks, project manage worldwide implementations, eventually working for several different service desk vendors. And then I sort of branched off and started running IT service management conferences, which is probably where most people would know me from, running conferences up in Scotland and looking at every IT service management product on the planet, and loads of presentations. So I'm lucky enough to have seen a lot of people presenting what they believe to be the best solutions and the best features and the best methodologies. So that's my side of the world. Steve, let's have a little intro to you, because it's somewhat different from my background.
It's a little bit different. Yeah, but we've converged a few times along the way, I think. I, like yourself, used to have a proper job. I worked in NatWest in IT for 15 years, and left there a long time ago. And I've been around a few consulting firms, so a few kind of niche consulting firms, and also KPMG for a big chunk of time as well, where I delivered some fairly big and complex change programs, us using that kind of service management knowledge that I'd acquired over the years. And then I formed Syniad IT 10 years ago, and we've really been at the forefront of a lot of the development in the SIAM world, so service integration and management, which perhaps we'll come on to in a subsequent talk in the future. That will be great. But also process maturity assessment is one of the key products that we deliver, and I've got tons of experience and bugbears and things to share with you today in that particular area. So I'm hoping this is going to be a really interesting and engaging conversation. Just reiterate what we were saying earlier on. Feel free, guys, to chip in as we go along, and we will adapt as necessary. No puns from me. Back to you, Martin.
So hi Mo, thanks for joining us and being the first person to drop in a comment. Hopefully you won't be the last. And so we're going to say hello to anybody who's dropping in comments. We're glad to have you here. As we say, you're part of the show and we want you to help us, direct us in some way or another. As part of this whole thing, I asked Steve to create a new white paper on ITSM assessments that was up to date and current. And I've seen the beta version, so what it's starting off with. And one of the things that jumped out to me straight away was that Steve's sort of headline was audits versus assessment. What's the difference? Don't confuse the two. Enlighten us.
Well, so audits are tend to have a very strict running order or set of criteria of things that they are auditing against. They tend to be conducted by auditors who may not necessarily have a deep subject matter knowledge to support the audit. I know this to be true because I have been an auditor with not very much subject matter knowledge in the subject I was auditing in at the time when I was at KPMG. They tend to come armed with a set of criteria, sometimes that is on a clipboard, and they walk along with a pen and they're ticking boxes. Have you got this? Have you got that? Have you got this? And you might say, yes, I've got that, and they'll put a tick in the box. You might say, no, I haven't got that, and they'll put a cross in a box. But the appropriateness of the thing that they are auditing to your organization isn't necessarily being considered, nor are any accentuating circumstances. So, well, we haven't got this because we're doing this thing in a few weeks' time or whatever. Or we might say, oh, yeah, we have got that, but we don't follow it. We've just got this artifact. Well, the fact you've got the artifact, be it, let's say it's a process document, for example. So you've got an incident management process document. So the audit criteria is the incident process documented? Gets a tick in the box. Is it being followed consistently? Do people understand it? Is it being continually improved? Might not be criteria on that audit, if you see what I mean. So audits tend to arrive at an outcome which is very binary and a little bit narrow in its scope, whereas assessments, which I think are the better vehicle for the majority of IT management, IT leaders or listening in on this call, are more flexible. They adapt. They are more rich in their content because they will have someone who is perhaps a subject matter expert who can say, well, that process you told me you had then, do you follow it? Do you improve it? Show me some evidence. Can I sit with people who are executing that process to see what it looks like in the real world? Can I see some KPIs to support it? So it tends to have more depth and more richness than just a tick in a box. And that was what I was trying to say in that white paper that we've been batting around, Martin. And I'm thinking that for me, that's the most critical step at the outset, right? Do you really want an assessment, or do you want an audit? And audits might lead to some form of certification. ISO 20000 would be a good example, right? We've just got a client who's gone for ISO 20000. but they're not particular experts in the delivery of service management. They're absolutely fantastic at fulfilling the criteria of an audit.
Okay.
So
So that almost comes down to the, we're teaching you how to pass the exam. You need all of these elements, but we're not teaching you actually how to be good at something. We're just saying
precisely.
you've got all the books on the shelf, right? You get a tick for each one. It's binary, it's black and white. That leads me nicely on to the next slide. Let's go. So for anybody who thought this was going to be simple and there's only one type of assessment, albeit we've jumped from audits to assessments already, there are multiple different types of assessment. And I do have a statement from a LinkedIn user. So your names quite often pop up, but if you are not visible on LinkedIn, then I may well just get LinkedIn user. So LinkedIn user, let me know who you are, perhaps. And it says, I'm nodding my head in agreement with Steve's comments about auditors' lack of subject matter expertise. This is despite many of them being IT auditors.
Mm.
So I think we can all agree with that. But let's
I would
run
say
down.
though, there's some exceptions to this. Sorry, there's some exceptions to that. So I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush, right? There are some auditors who do know their stuff. My observation was there are some people, there are some auditors, a large majority of auditors, you might say, who don't necessarily have the depth of subject matter knowledge. I don't want to start a war with the auditors, Martin. I don't want them coming around and bludgeoning me to death with their clipboards.
Too late. If you hear a knock at the door and Steve leaves, it's not the
That
Amazon
could
man
be it.
coming.
Could be it. I'm keeping an eye out now.
Okay, let's run down a few of these different types of assessments and the sort of pluses and negatives, if you like. I'll take the top one to start with. Self-assessments online. There's quite a lot of these now, and some are done by some very big companies as well, actually. The major bugbear, well, there's two or three that actually I have with them, but one of them is that a self-assessment online is a one size fits all type of bag. And if it's one size fits all, what we really know is that that's not going to fit anybody particularly well. And a lot of them that I see are just endless lists of questions, endless lists covering everything you could possibly think of. So for me, one size fits all doesn't fit too well. The fact that they cover everything on the planet is not great. It
Mm,
also tends to be completed by a single person. So it's a binary view on what is actually happening within your organization. And quite often it can be a rather optimistic view on sort of filling something in, just doing it online, and you're sort of running through the process to get an outcome that you want to get and give to your boss, rather than looking for areas that you can improve. So typically, I find people come out shining from these self-assessments where they have marked their own homework and delivered the results to their
mm,
boss to tell them they're brilliant. So I don't get it. The online one size fits all doesn't work for me. I guess an enhancement on that, a slight enhancement anyway, is the assessments that you can download. So you download a bunch of questions. The advantage to me there is that at least you can spread them amongst a bunch of people and get multiple different answers, and perhaps bring the answers together to get a more formulated opinion across a
mm.
number of different people and stakeholders. So they may be better, but they still suffer from the same undefined one size fits all. So
Yes.
for me, that is the downside of any self-assessment that is predefined and pre-packaged. Is it's not going to be directly for your organization.
And it's subjective, Martin, right? You know, the motives of the people conducting that assessment may not necessarily be compatible with getting an objective view of your organization's maturity. As you've said, you made the line to show your boss. You know, if I was a service manager responsible for improving certain process areas, and I'd spent the last 6 months, 12 months doing it, and I wanted some evidence to support it, I'm not going to fill in those questions which are, um, which would somehow be derogatory or somehow negative to about my performance. I think in my mind, this term might not come out very well, but it's assessment for the Tinder generation. It's it's superficial.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly how I would position it. So number three, a facilitated assessment. What do I mean by that? I think this is really one where the vendor, and there normally is a vendor at this point for a facilitated assessment, is going to help you out. Now, what I have witnessed with that type of assessment, because it's one up from a total self-assessment, because they are saying, here's a bunch of questions, let's run through them. But I'm not always convinced about the outputs, because what normally happens is you answer a bunch of questions that they've asked you directly. That then goes into some sort of a process scoring machine or algorithm or AI, and then there's a report that's produced, which is effectively a templated report or an AI report based upon the facts
Mm,
and figures coming in. So, what's
yeah.
your experience on that type of assessment? Because it will be far greater than mine.
It's kind of if this then that type assessment, right? So if someone puts if score for is process documented equals no, then recommendation equals document this process, right? So it's a little bit it can be a little bit lacking that richness and depth. The benefit of the facilitated assessment is there should be someone there looking into the whites of your eyes and saying, is that really true? And perhaps in some cases getting some kind of evidence to support it. But once again, it kind of lacks that depth. And it tends to be as a means to an end. So I've seen these conducted as a precursor to an ITSM tool implementation, for example. So the vendor comes along and says, tell us a little bit about your processes. I've got this pre-prepared thing. I'm going to either run it as a workshop or 40 people fill out this spreadsheet and we'll run a presentation at the end that tells you all about it. So again, it does tend to lack a bit of depth to it. But horses for courses, right? It might be appropriate in some cases where there's speed is of the essence, depth isn't important, and you might not have a lot of budget. Then it can actually play a part, but I wouldn't necessarily trust the outputs that it throws out at the end.
Well, interestingly enough, we've got David Barrow commenting in here and agreeing with you totally with regards to the bias, or agreeing with both of us with regards to the bias.
Hmm.
But he has said
Thanks.
the auditor's revenge, Steve's clipboard nightmare. So
Yeah. They're coming for me, David. They're
that,
coming for me right now. I'm going to lock the door. I think ahead of the
yeah.
next ahead of the next stream that we do. I think it would be a good idea. But no, thanks, David, for your comments. That's really appreciated.
We can keep them at a virtual arm's length. So let's move on. Number four, ranking assessments. What am I talking about? Ranking assessments. I'm talking about assessments that give you sort of a rating of 0 to 100 or 1 to 5 or a star rating or something like that. And again, most of these seem to be a one size fits all. And if I'm just going to pick out sort of like a couple of different elements on these, let's rewind it a little bit. If your organization is, let's say, a university, and then organization B is a managed service provider, and they both take this same ranking assessment that's going to give them a star rating of 1 to 5. They don't do the same job. They've got entirely different jobs. So how can you possibly have a ranking which applies across these different areas?
Hmm.
And the other thing that I've noticed about some of them is they will predefine what you need to have. without knowing what you do as a business. So they will say, you need these 30 reports if you're going to be a 4-star help desk. And I look at these reports and they're all backward facing reports. Now, it doesn't mean to say they're not generating interesting data from what you did last month or the month before or the month before. But what I would say is that as I guess an efficient service desk, what I really want to see is what I can do about things now. So what's happening in real time, in real life? What's the business impact to associated with what's going on right now? And then I want to have a look at the predictive analysis of what's likely to happen. Are server XYZ going to go down because they've got super heavy load? What's going to happen there? Can I predictively remove problems before they occur? I don't want to be told I need 30 reports looking backwards to make me a good service desk, because I then look at the other elements within that ranking assessment. None of these things are included. None of the things which I would consider to be hot today's capabilities from service desk tools seem to be missing. A lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of these rankings seem to be based upon what you should have been doing years and years ago. And ITIL v3 sitting in the background there somewhere or other, and people are trying to match up with that. So what's your opinion on that type of assessment, Steve?
I think there's a few big risks with it from my perspective. So it gets confused with benchmarking quite commonly. In other words, how do we compare against other organizations? And as you've already described, apples and oranges there. Would a university want to be compared to a managed service provider? The other big issue with them is, and we do this, right? So my organization, we put a ranking if the client wants us to, against the assessment findings, but we do it against a predefined set of criteria. But the risk with them is I'm a 4.5. I'm not a 4. Definitely a 4.5. And you'll spend an hour and a half talking about the difference between a 4 and a 4.5, and maybe you'll settle on a score which doesn't even exist in your scoring structure, 4.25, just to placate someone who doesn't want to be perceived as it being bad for his particular role. So I think I've spent far too much of my time negotiating scores. So it has to be against a particular mechanism that you're doing it against, with evidence in there, and the evidence has to be pertinent to that organization. So we don't natively do it on every assessment, but sometimes clients say, "Oh, could we have a score?" And we agree what the criteria are from that and score them appropriately. Particularly some of our repeat customers who do assessments with us periodically. So every 6 to 12 months, we'll go and reassess them. And under those circumstances, a score is a good indicator for them. But the massive, massive risk is the preoccupation with the score and a complete disregard at its extremes for the observations and the recommendations. So a good assessment report, which we'll come on to, contains some observations and some recommendations, right? And you don't want to be sitting there going, "Well, I'm a 3.25 rather than a 4 on this." It just detracts from the true value that you're trying to extract from the assessment in the first place.
I think there's been a couple of good comments come through while we're talking about that. We've got one saying, "You don't want to give your CIO bad news." We'll come on to a particular phrase in a minute. Yeah, we will be coming on to that. So thank you, LinkedIn user, for that. We've also got Gary saying that product vendor-led assessments can lead you in a particular direction that just by chance happens to align with all the features that they have in their product set. So,
but some features aren't in your license structure. So, by the way, you need to add an additional module to your product, and the salesman's eyes are wide like this. And, wow, yeah, we've managed to sell that. We've told them they need this um, bit of this additional add-on. I nearly named a very common add-on that salesmen try to sell on a very common ITSM tool, but I'll try not to.
Okay,
But
but that would get you from a 3 to a 4, you see.
it would, because you'd have that capability to produce all of those reports, Martin, and wow, your maturity would be through the roof, and your efficiency and effectiveness would also increase. But yet, there's no science or facts to support that.
Yeah, and I think, there's a danger of people being very disappointed that they've done 6 months work and they're still at a 3 when they're actually at a 3.8 from a 3.1, but because they're only a 3, they're kind of, oh, I'm only a 3, why not a 4? Oh, well, you didn't quite get there. So there is a bit of a hidden element there, and Mick Cook makes a good point here,
Hello,
and
Mick.
he's saying models can be over-spec'd. Not every organization needs to be a 5 in every area. And that's back to my, if you're doing totally different jobs, oranges, apples, pears, then yeah, the requirements there are totally different. So
Well, it's
it's
been a long time since I've heard from Mick. So hello, Mick, by the way, and thanks for watching. But yeah, I agree with Mick. A 3 might be appropriate for that organisation, and yet you produce those scores up to your CIO and get your knuckles wrapped because you've not achieved the desired standards. So yeah, I think that's a massive risk as well.
And I noticed David saying that we've managed to alienate both auditors and salespeople within 27 minutes.
We've done
We're
pretty
doing,
good, haven't we? Yeah.
yeah.
That wasn't the intent. We didn't set out to just try and alienate every other job role other than consultant in there. But maybe we're just too grumpy and old, Martin. Maybe we need to cheer up a little bit.
No, we're allowed to do what we like now.
I
That's
think we can actually. Yeah.
that's part
I'm
of growing up.
hoping. I'm hoping that those watching really want us to as well. Now they're going to see.
Okay.
Stay tuned, folks. Let's see who else we can upset over the course of the remaining 33 minutes.
So well, let's do number 5 then, assessments to a standard. But you already started to bring that up, which is people trying to assess to ISO 20000 or ITIL 4 or whatever. And again, we're kind of repeating ourselves here, which is why are you assessing yourself to the whole gambit of everything if you don't need to do all of that? So it's again teaching people how to pass the exam rather than to show that they are successful, which takes you straight on to number 6, which I know is your favorite type of assessment because you do them. Therefore, you're a little bit biased, but tell us why conversational assessments
I'm
are
very
better
biased.
than
I'm
the
very
above.
biased. I'm biased about this for one big reason. It works. So I think that if you put someone who's got years of experience in front of a client process owner, and you say, I don't know, let's use incident management because it's an easy target, but tell me about what happens in your organization when something bad happens. What talk me through the life cycle of an incident. Who calls, how are they raised? Where are they raised from? What data do you capture? Show me that in the tool. You're running to a scope, and we'll come on to that later, Martin, in terms of certain process areas that you particularly want to look at. But running it in terms of, well, tell me more about that then. And they'll say, I don't know. Well, we don't have any phone calls coming in. We only use email as our inbound means of incidents. Oh, tell me about that then. How many did you get? Oh, 7,000 a month. Oh, okay. And what's the backlog then? How quickly are you turning them around? That sort of thing enables you to very quickly hone in on some of the big issues that you might experience. By all means, you've got a cheat sheet to make sure that you're not just meandering through a conversation. You're kind of you're aligning with commonly understood kind of process flows for those types of things, and that's why doing it in a chronological order a timeline of around an incident or a change or a request or whatever it might be, um, is very important. I use their incident change and request because it always makes me laugh. You know, it's 2023 and we still have organizations, because of their complexity and because of the ways in which they deliver their IT services, we're still struggling to do the simple things right. Um, so we'll come on to that. We'll talk about scope, I'm sure. But the point is, with a conversational assessment, it is adaptive. The person conducting it has deep knowledge. They're able to dig a little bit more. They can spot quickly the red flags and start to delve deeply into those. Um, Someone once said to me as we were doing an assessment, "Can we have an advanced copy of all the questions you're going to ask us?" And I was, well, no, not really, but I can show you. I can talk to you about some of the artifacts I might want to look at, but I can't tell you all the questions I'm going to ask you because I don't know yet. Because I'm going to react based on the answers that you give me. So yeah, adaptive, reacts to the needs of the organisation, and ultimately at the beginning of the assessment, you're going to set a scope with some objectives. And in the back of my mind, always is going to be, well, what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve here? Are we bringing on a new service provider and therefore we need to understand whether they're going to be able to support it? Are we merging two organizations, launching new products, whatever it might be? And I know we've got some content on that later, Martin, but we have that ability to adapt accordingly based on the objectives and the outcomes that the assessment is trying to achieve. And for me, that feels like a real value added approach. That feels like something the client could very happily feel that they're getting value for money for achieving that, rather than that superficial Tinder swipe left, swipe right type assessment, which is binary, lacks depth, and is subjective.
Yeah, and I think David's making a good point in the comments here, which is conversational assessments allowed you to work with people and help them, which is
Mm,
kind of key. It's the working with
yeah,
people and
absolutely.
targeting stuff as well and directing things. Mick's making a point about risk-based analysis, and we'll come on to that, Mick. So bear with us. We've got a few slides to go through. We're going to massively run over. I knew we would, but here goes.
Yeah, well, that's fine. Oh, are you going to tell them or am I, Marty?
You are. It's your job to tell them. So this is us talking to the CIO, CFO, whoever, head of IT, who's been in the organization for 30 years and building it up to be super special and follow processes exactly and brilliant, 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 and got to keep all their staff motivated. And you come in and do an assessment and you have to tell someone their baby is ugly. And that is one of the most difficult things to do. I've come across it on just about everything you ever do. This pops up. Somebody will get upset about this, which kind of makes me think, is it easier to do things as an external auditor coming in and then going away rather than an internal sort of review process and assessment?
Mm, mm,
Because you don't want to be the most hated person in the company. So maybe you know, jazz it up a bit, don't want to upset people, have a bias, that type of thing. An external viewpoint could be a better one. Having said that, maybe the external person doesn't know the in-depth workings of a particular company. So how have you dealt with your baby being ugly and the internal external argument in the past, as well as the different methods of assessments and follow-ups as well, because it's not always
mm.
the same. You
No.
could go in, do an assessment, as somebody mentioned earlier on, plug in your new tool, and then doing another assessment and show that it's brilliant. I guess you could go in, make recommendations, help with implementing them. You could go in, make recommendations, and let the client implement them. and then come back at a later date.
Mhm, mhm,
What's your
mhm.
opinions on processes and everything around ugly babies, if that's not too bad a phrase?
So often you get the situation whereby the client takes you to one side and says, "Look, I know it's bad, but I need you to tell them because they won't believe me." Um, so often through the mere fact that you are independent carries with it some some gravitas. And in addition to that, I would also build I'd spend a lot of time building trust and credibility and integrity. So, you know, no one's going to believe a word that you say if you haven't got the experience and the knowledge to be able to back that up, right? So, me and this isn't a sales pitch, right? But me and my consultants that we use here, we've all had proper jobs, and I think that's really important. I can talk to a counterpart in IT on a peer-to-peer basis. I'm not the assessor, I'm not the auditor. I'm a consultant who happens to have some really in-depth knowledge. So I think that carries a lot of weight. That helps. It's the difference between your next door neighbor calling your baby ugly and a pediatrician calling your baby ugly, right? They might have a bit more knowledge and support of perhaps of behind them and experience behind them to justify that. I think also reports need to be balanced, and we do try to balance reports where it's possible. We search for the diamonds in the rough, and often you have to search very long and hard. But sometimes there are some really good things that need to be brought out. So an assessment report is not um, an assassination of all of the process owners or the leadership or whatever. It's an objective view of where we're at, and it does need to be balanced. And I think we justify observations of your baby being ugly through something that's really important, and it's evidence. So, we would say the incident management process, for example, is not fit for purpose, and this is why. This is what we've found that supports that, and this is why you've got tons of service outages or people who are not efficient in performing their role, or your governance is inadequate and therefore you're not making decisions in a timely way, or whatever. Oh, I think one of my favorite ones, actually, let me just tell you this little story. We had a client who paid a very large amount of money for a managed service provider, who then who then charged them in addition on a per ticket basis. So it was in the service provider's interests to have more tickets because they got more money then. So every ticket got closed off at the earliest opportunity. And if the client had another issue, they had to phone and raise a new one. Because, of course, every time that happened, the service provider got more money. Have we just alienated all the service providers as well, Martin? Not
Have a
all
few.
service not all service providers do this. Sorry, guys, but this was an example, and it was a recent one as well. Um, so I do think that evidence is a critical part in accepting the ugliness of your baby. Uh, I would seek to justify the comment with facts rather than just make an assertion.
Well, I can obviously see you're passionate about that, either because, well, there's either mini earthquakes going on, or you're banging your desk about, which is moving your
I am
camera
banging my
around.
desk. Oh, I must stop doing that. Sorry. I've got a lovely shiny new microphone, especially for this event, but it's incredibly sensitive. And when I get excited, I do bang the desk. So it might be the auditors knocking at the door, though. That could be they're just kicking the door down as we speak, joined now by the salesman and the service provider community.
Yeah, that's a lot of people are upset already. But anyway, being as we've upset people, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so that one had a little bit of treasure going on. So behind all of these assessments, there is a lot of treasure, or diamonds, as you mentioned, diamonds in the rough. to find from an assessment. Now, this is quite a comprehensive looking little list. Let me tell you how I put it together. I went to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT to give me the most common reasons that people run assessments. So the goals from those assessments. And I gave it all sorts of different references so that it was, scanning the whole universe and bringing together all of the goals and outcomes of assessments that are most common across the whole planet, I suppose. So it's an interesting list. It's not one that I created. It's not one that you created. It's gathered from all different walks of life. So I'd kind of be interested from the perspective of people watching, which ones jump out to them as a primary or secondary reason for running an assessment, because that's definitely going to determine how you target things and what type of assessment you do. So let's see if anybody gives us a little bit of feedback on there. I see Robert saying that he's stuck with something similar to what we were talking about before. But Steve, which ones of those jump out as you and align it to your client base? And what are they saying to you? Which ones are they focusing on?
Number 4, number 6 are quite common, aren't they? Optimizing resources and reducing costs in the interest of doing more with less. So that's very common. IT would love to align with the business goals if it possibly could, if the business knew what their goals were and would tell IT. So I think that can often be a challenge for technology leaders, is chasing those business goals and getting clarity on them. I think 1 and 8 are very similar too, right? Improving processes and identifying improvement opportunities. So, that the whole continual improvement ethic is very strong. It's alive and well in a lot of organizations, but knowing what to run after is one of the most important things. And other than that, I think benchmark is something completely different. I think with discount, number 10, and customer sat will be a byproduct of all of those activities rather than a particular reason. I think you get some of this is a little bit confused between reasons why they would want to do it and situations under which they would need to do it. So I would add into this list on the situations, mergers, moving to a SIAM operating model, for example. All of those things would require some form of assessment activity as well. Yeah, have we had any other feedback, Martin?
Yeah, so David's saying number 2, but align organizational goals across the board. So that comes back to a very recent live stream that you did with Claire Agata yesterday,
Yes.
I think, discussing IT operating models as opposed to business operating models. Go back and have a look at that, David, if you didn't see it. It was very good. We're not going to get onto it in any detail here because we're already shooting towards the end of our time frame. And I'm still going to run through a couple of the slides, possibly a bit quicker than we originally intended to. But this one, I want to come back to in a future session, and perhaps we'll run a poll and get some more feedback from people to try and get more of a sort of a balance. So next slide. So you were starting to get ahead of yourself there, because I've got scope and audience as the sort of next topic there to speak about, which is really right back to are we doing an assessment on SIAM? Has somebody suddenly said XLAs are the way to go? We just want to do XLAs, nothing else. Is that the focus of our current where we want to be? Or somebody's just 10 years after it came out, read the Phoenix Project book and decided we're all going DevOps. And as a result of that, we're getting rid of change management totally. And, it's these sort of things. Well, what's the assessments about? And once you've scoped it, you need to know, well, what audience do I therefore need to target this at? Because you should never do an assessment with just one person, right? It shouldn't be you marking your own homework. You need to have your business stakeholders in there as part of that assessment, and not necessarily all the people who you think are going to give you good feedback either, because some of the negative feedback can be something that can be turned into positive news and actually help you drive things. So there's a balance between scope and audience. How do you address that balance?
I think from my perspective, you've got to be defining some outcomes and objectives that you're looking to achieve. So I generally spend quite a lot of time at the beginning, scope before we even talk about scope. So more, why are we doing this then? What are those reasons from the outset, that we want to go through and do this activity? And in terms of specific scope items, I'd be wanting to start with the real simple stuff. There seems to be a common theme on my streams this week, which is keep it simple. But we do tend to overcomplicate things, and we do want to assess our capability in areas where we haven't even started to touch the sides of things yet, because we've not done the simple things, right first of all. So I would generally encourage clients to stick with a very simple set. There's a very noisy aeroplane going over. I'm not sure if the microphone is picking that up as well. I think it's dropping off salesmen by parachute to invade the shed quarters here. But um, yeah, I think setting that scope appropriately, keeping it simple, keeping it short, understanding the objectives and the outcomes is really important. That is the scope drives the duration and ultimately the cost, right? Because the number of people you need to talk to in that conversational way that I've just described will be driven directly by the scope. So we work on the basis that we typically do um, 3 1.5 hour interviews a day. Um, and that can be with one or two people or a group. Um, and you've got maybe a week's worth of discovery time. So multiply that out, how many slots you've got and how many people you need to talk to drives the duration of that discovery phase at the beginning of any assessment activity. But I think it's vital then to set um, appropriate expectations at the outset in terms of, well, this is the scope, these are the objectives, these are the outcomes, these are the stakeholders that are going to be involved, this is the approach that we're going to adopt, and these are the deliverables that you're then going to get at the outset. So all of that all needs to be done before we even start.
Well,
Because
I
otherwise,
think,
yeah.
yeah, that brings me on to a story of not getting it quite right. And
Mm, mm,
I decided on a particular assessment, I'd got a tool for the assessment. So I was going to assess everybody in this company, sort of 300 or 400 people. The information all came back, and we got sort of 300 or 400 different points to address before we could do anything else with the assessment data, because they were direct complaints to IT effectively.
mm.
Uh,
Right.
and so, for instance, um, it was in an NHS trust actually, and they had implemented this wonderful policy where they're going to have shared printers. So no more printers in rooms. We're going to share printers. It had been a massive success because they'd saved a load of money. They then got feedback from a whole bunch of doctors who said, I now have to walk down the corridor and 2 or 3 minutes and stand by the printer while it prints out confidential information, which I
Mm,
previously printed out in my own office. So IT have totally shot themselves in the foot. They've saved some money on
mm.
paper, but the
Yeah.
doctors are now running up and down the corridors, standing by the printer, waiting for it to print stuff out. And all that type of thing came out in the assessment, which was nothing to do with where we were originally wanting to go in terms of scoping IT service management. But actually, it
Mm.
turned out the client was delighted because they could make loads of people happy with this instant feedback. So I got the expectations all wrong. I got the assessment all wrong, but we still got good stuff out of it. So, that's another happy story, which is taking us towards the end of today's session. Massively run over, but I suspected we were. So I've just got an agenda potentially for next week. Let's have a look at that. So these are some of the points which I knew we just wouldn't get to. And we've not really gone into as much depth as perhaps we could have on some of the stuff we've already got. But what I think we could probably do in the next session is look at a whole bunch of challenges that we may we know that you're going to face with people on board of the ugly baby side of things, but there'll be people who don't like anybody coming in and telling them what to do. There will be people who are disruptors, who don't want to change, all those sort of things. But if we know about the potential problems before they arise, then perhaps we can use them to our advantage, and so on and so forth, going down this giant list of actions and responsibilities, and making sure that you market your assessment, you have high level buy-in, you create an implementation plan, you know who's responsible for each element of that. What do you do with the outputs? Who reviews them? What processes do you go through to evaluate the outputs and rank your opportunities? And there are a whole load of special formulas for those type of things. How do we create the CSI roadmap, and how do we measure the progress? And then eventually we'll maybe come around to letting people know where they can download your in progress white paper at the end of next week. So I think we've got through a lot today. It was kind of the baseline for what is an assessment. It's not just something that's online and ticking a load of boxes. There is a lot of different types of assessment. Some will be more applicable than others, because if you are going down a conversational route, then you are going to be using up people's time. Okay, so that's one big deal. You can go down a cheap self-assessment route and just get one person to fill something out. Does that really work for anyone? I'm not convinced it does. But there is a balance to be struck on interviewing the whole company and getting so much information back that it becomes unworkable, really. So I'm just going to read out a comment from Gareth, and just say, thanks to Robert and David and Mick and everybody else who's joined us and contributed to the session. So Gareth's saying, hello chaps, how have you handled the challenge whereby, 1, you've told the client their baby is ugly, 2, evidenced why this is true, 3, made recommendations to make the baby pretty, but somehow they're still making the baby even uglier?
What a great question.
Luckily,
time to answer that now, or are we out of time?
He says maybe one for next time.
Yeah, so, let's hope so. Yeah, we'll bear that one in mind, Gareth. Tune in next time and we'll do that.
But thanks for that. That's good. We get to do a little shameless plug at the end of this, so hang on a second. Right, for those of you who are not already connected to either Steve or myself on LinkedIn, for the moment, always point in the wrong direction. This is probably the easiest thing. We know you've all got your phones out there. So if you point at that top green QR code, that will take you to my LinkedIn profile. The next one down will take you to Steve's profile on LinkedIn. And then we've got our 2 websites up there as well. I am a Freshworks partner. If you want to talk about Freshworks and software, you can. And if you want to talk with Steve about assessments in detail and his services, go to his website. That's our very short plug for the end of the session. What we're going to be doing is, I'm currently setting up a YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch everything on YouTube. It's not there at the moment because there'll only be one video up there. So we'll next week let you know where that is, and hopefully you can go on and subscribe. But if for the moment you've enjoyed today's session and want to come back next week, which we hope you do, then please keep an eye out on my posts in particular for the next day or so, where I'll put up next week's session, and you can go register for that one as well. I haven't put the two up together just to avoid confusion, but the more people, the merrier on the sessions. We had 60 odd people signing up, which was fantastic for a first session. And therefore, I suspect what we'll be doing these again and possibly again and possibly again. So it will be at 12 noon next week, same time, same place, effectively. So thank you for everybody who's joined us again. That's a brilliant session. We said we'd try and keep it to 45 minutes. We failed miserably and got to just about an hour. But thanks for everybody who said that the session's been really good. And David's going to share it with auditors and salespeople on LinkedIn, apparently.
Please don't, David. Thank you.
Okay, right. Cheerio from Edinburgh.
Cheerio from Essex.
Yeah. See you later, guys.
Thanks.